Truth Espresso, episode 298.
Face it, we all would rather sleep in this morning. That's why God gave us espresso, to kickstart our zombified corpses into hyperdrive. And now, giving your mind and soul the morning shot of truth it craves. This is Truth Espresso with Daniel Minnick.
Well, hey there, friends, family, foes, and of course, lurkers alike. This is your host, Daniel Minnick, for yet another episode of Truth Espresso. And in this episode, I'm going to continue a recent series discussing the recent trial, the New York trial, over the so-called hush money payments and felony business record entries that former President Donald Trump made. And of course, as you're listening to this, you likely know what happened, how the trial reached a verdict, and of course how the mainstream media has thoroughly enjoyed referring to the former president and current most popular candidate running for President Donald Trump as convicted felon Donald Trump. And this episode is part 2 of covering the trial. And so if you haven't listened to last week's episode, I would highly encourage you to do that. It lays the groundwork for what the charges, as they were in this case, the background to the Stormy Daniels payments, and of course, Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen. And so if you're interested in that, check out last week's episode. And in this week's episode, we're going to look at some of the pre-trial activity up to the trial. As I said in the last episode, this trial is like drinking from a fire hose. And so last week, I wasn't quite sure if I'd be able to cover the whole trial. And of course, I did not have everything ready for all the details I wanted to get into. And so that warranted a part 2. And of course, as I'm saying this and gathered notes for part 2, I am now saying that there will be a part 3. And so this episode, pre-trial stuff. And there's a lot to get into even with the pre-trial stuff. So as a recap from last week, we talked about how in July of 2006, Trump had met a certain Stephanie Clifford, most commonly known now as Stormy Daniels, in her professional career at a celebrity golf tournament, and supposedly had an affair there. I'm not saying yay or nay, but that's the story. And then in 2011, Trump thought about running for president, and Daniels wanted to make a big splash by releasing the story about her encounter with Trump. Trump was exploring running for president at the time, and so he did not want that to hurt his campaign. And his lawyer, Michael Cohen, arranged with the magazine that Daniels wanted to publish the story for not to go ahead and do that. And then in 2016, when Trump made it definite, and we remember the Golden Escalator event where Trump announced his run for president, that kind of sealed the deal. And so Stormy Daniels' agent, Gina Rodriguez, wanted to publish Daniels' story in the National Enquirer. And then this is what ultimately caused the charges for Trump's trial, because his lawyer, Michael Cohen, tried to suppress the story by paying Daniels $130,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And then over the course of the year, Cohen was struggling with trying to get the finances. He drew money from a home equity line of credit to pay Daniels toward the end of 2016. And then, because Trump made various payments to his lawyer, Michael Cohen, for legal expenses from April of 2017 to December 2017, and he included extra payments to cover taxes and stuff, these payments that Trump made to Cohen provided the basis for the charges against Trump. Now, in last week, we covered the fact that Michael Cohen in 2018 was arrested and charged for campaign finance violations. Among other things that Cohen did that didn't involve Trump, Cohen supposedly owed taxes on some millions of dollars he had not reported because of his taxi business. And then Cohen ultimately went to prison for 3 years. But at this point, because Cohen was trying to avoid implicating Trump with the hush money payments, and then he still ended up having to face some prison time, he considered that he was taking the bullet for Trump with these charges, and now his relationship with Trump was souring more. And by the time you get to this trial, Cohen has it out for Trump, and he's hoping that his testimony against Trump will ultimately land Trump in prison out of revenge for Cohen having to go to prison partly because of charges related to those payments. So now let's get to some of the pre-trial activities that happened. And you probably recall that on August 9th, 2022, the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago, and the FBI searched for classified documents that Trump allegedly had not properly returned to the archives. And it was recently revealed that the FBI was authorized to use what are called deadly force if necessary if Trump happened to show up. Trump was not there to witness this happen, but if Trump had showed up or had said or did anything in resistance, the FBI was authorized to use deadly force. And a lot of Trump supporters would say that this particular raid was kind of a warning to Trump because it seemed like Trump at this time was preparing to run for a second term, and the powers that be did not like that, and so they wanted to flex their muscles and fire a warning shot, metaphorically speaking, with actual weapons there for the people currently working at Mar-a-Lago to say, you better cooperate and you better let us get what we're looking for. They had searched Melania's wardrobe and stuff, and they got the classified documents. And of course, to cover all the stuff related to that particular case would of course require separate episodes, and I have no idea if I'm planning to do that. I'm just covering Trump's New York trial because it's the one that actually ended and reached a verdict, so I figured I should talk about that. It's history in the making here. But nevertheless, some people would say that the Mar-a-Lago raid was a warning to Trump. Don't run for president. We are going to make life difficult for you if you try to do that. But nevertheless, Trump did announce his run for president for the second term. And of course, it wasn't long after that that various cases, various charges, various attempts to try to even get Trump tied up in court in 2024 during campaigning season. Now we go to this particular trial, the people of New York versus Trump, and we observe particular things about the judge who was picked for Trump's trial here. Supposedly judges are picked at random, but it's interesting the coincidence as this judge was one of a pool of about 20 judges, if I recall correctly, who could have been picked, and it just happened to be one who's also involved in other trials, other cases related to people from Trump's former cabinet. So the judge in this case is Judge Juan Merchan. And the controversy over this judge is the fact that he donated to Joe Biden's 2020 campaign. And of course, that might show a bias because Joe Biden was the opponent of Donald Trump, of course, in the 2020 election. And so if you have a judge that wants the other guy to win, and he's the judge presiding over a case where the one charged, the defendant, is that very opponent that he did not want elected, who also just happens to be running for president against the very same Joe Biden, to which this judge donated money for his campaign. Yeah, you might question the impartiality of justice regarding Judge Juan Merchan. Now, it wasn't a lot of money. according to records, I think it was about $35 that Judge Mershon split between the Democrat PAC Act Blue and some to the Progressive Turnout Project's Stop Republicans campaign. Now, the Progressive Turnout Project organization has several campaigns to which you can allocate some donations. One of them is called Stop Republicans. So Judge Mershon donated to Act Blue, which tries to fund Democrat candidates for various offices and their campaigns, and then to the Progressive Turnout Project's Stop Republicans campaign, so you can see where his ideology is and where his allegiances lie. Now, someone might point out, well, it was just $35, and of course, lots of people will donate money to various campaigns. You can't expect a judge to have no political affiliations and not have the ability ever to donate to various campaigns, but of course, there is that question over how impartial he could possibly be to someone like Donald J. Trump. Another issue with this is the fact that Juan Mershon's daughter, Lauren Mershon, herself also works as a Democrat political consultant for the organization Authentic Campaigns Incorporated. And she has been making millions of dollars from this trial. In fact, even before the trial itself started, in months leading up to the trial, Lauren Mershon had raked in close to $100 million in donations. And I'll provide a link to an article from the New York Post that mentioned that she had raised about $93 million at this time. This was before the trial. This was back in March of 2023. Now, wouldn't this be a biased conflict of interest? Because how can you separate the father from the daughter? And if the daughter's raking in tens of millions of dollars, possibly now even over $100 million from the very trial that her father is supposed to be presiding over, the outcome of this trial could also mean a different amount of money, or perhaps many of these donors were hoping that their money that they're donating to this campaign that the judge's daughter was involved in could result in the judge pushing for a certain outcome. Perhaps the best bang for their buck, if there's enough bucks in there, it could end up with the judge predetermined to make sure that a certain verdict would happen.
Hey, I'm Daryl, and I'm here with my wife, Karen.
What's up?
And we're the hosts of the What Are We Even Doing Here podcast, the podcast that seeks to answer the question that we've all asked, what are we even doing here? We cover topics such as marriage, family, life, and living a Christian life in this crazy world. We don't have all the answers, but we know where to look.
Subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on SoundCloud as we seek the kingdom of God and find out what we are even doing here.
Grace and peace.
Another thing that gets us to suspect just how not impartial this particular trial was, how there was people involved in this trial who would claim that they're doing it for justice, but they might have an axe to grind, involves the case of a certain Matthew Colangelo, who had started as an associate attorney general at the Department of Justice. He was appointed there when Joe Biden began as president, I believe. And he held this position being the third highest ranking official there at the DOJ. So, yeah, this is rather prestigious for an appointment there for someone in the DOJ. However, in December of 2023, as we're inching closer to the actual trial happening, Matthew Colangelo decided to do something drastic. He took a huge demotion by leaving the DOJ to work in a local capacity under Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. Now, you probably know without even listening to last week's episode, but we talked about last week's episode how a Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, is the one who brought the charges against Trump. He brought the indictment. He was the one who oversaw Trump getting arraigned or arrested for this particular case. So Matthew Colangelo, leaving a prestigious position to get far, far demoted to work in a local capacity under District Attorney Alvin Bragg in Manhattan, New York, is quite a humbling thing. So the question arises, and this even involved a pay cut. Now, it wasn't that big of a pay cut. I believe it was about $3,000 a year pay cut. But he decided to demote himself and get a pay cut. For what? Obviously not just something that would better his particular career, perhaps. Now, this is an extremely unusual move, which also raises a lot of suspicions, and it shows links between the Biden administration at the federal level and state-level jurisdictions and cases when it involves all this opposition toward Donald Trump and his particular campaign running for president with Joe Biden as the opponent. DOJ Attorney General Merrick Garland, who once was a handbreadth away from being appointed to the Supreme Court as one of the justices there, he praised Colangelo as Colangelo voluntarily decided to leave the perch there. So Colangelo left a prestigious federal position for a much more humble state position. For what? Out of the goodness of his heart? Well, if you remove any suspicions that you might have, you might think so, but of course there's way too many questions that arise here, especially given the fact that Matthew Colangelo has a record of leading many cases against Donald Trump. I'll provide a link from the New York Times in December 5th of 2022 that talks about several of the cases and investigations that Matthew Colangelo had against Donald Trump. So it seems like he sticks to things related to Donald Trump like Velcro. And of course, if there's a case going on that seems like, okay, this is the one that's going to go forward, a lot of the other ones got paused, they're caught up, they might not happen before the election in November of 2024. He might move to Manhattan to see what he can do to help out in the progress of justice. There are also records that the Democratic National Committee had paid Colangelo for his services, and I'll provide a link to a Fox News article by Brooke Singman entitled "Ex-top Biden DOJ official now prosecuting Trump was once paid by DNC for political consulting," in quotes. And that's the headline of an article. You can read about that, how Colangelo was paid by the DNC for political consulting. And so, yeah, Matthew Colangelo standing next to Alvin Bragg when Alvin Bragg talked about the verdict there. Yeah, hardly impartial there. A long opponent of Trump. I wouldn't be surprised myself if Matthew Colangelo eventually rejoins the DOJ for a job well done for his humble service in Manhattan, New York. You know, all this trial just smells to me like a repudiation of American federalism, to say the least. The Biden administration, Joe Biden himself, have answered questions asking about how much he or the federal administration is involved in this state case in New York. And of course, they would deny it. They would say that they're not involved. Even the federal cases, such as the documents case in Florida, that's a federal case, and Jack Smith was appointed to oversee that. But of course, wait. President Joe Biden is the opponent of Donald Trump in running for re-election in 2024. And just how much is he personally in the know and involved? Well, they're always denying, including Joe Biden, involvement in the prosecutions and investigations of Trump. How convenient, methinks. Now, some pre-trial activities that happened before the trial began on April 15th of 2024. Some of these pre-trial activities with the court began as with the charges and Trump being arraigned. So April 3rd, 2023, Trump flew from his residence in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, to New York, where he spent the night at Trump Tower. And I remember listening to podcasts and various coverage on the news where they like to show, here's the airplane in the air, Trump is on his way to New York to face arrest, and they're so giddy and on all the coverage that they're getting about that historic time where a former president, this would be the first time that a former president was actually arraigned for a crime. So the next day, April 4th, 2023, Trump was arraigned for the charges of this case by District Attorney Alvin Bragg. As we know, the police booked him and fingerprinted him, but he didn't have a mugshot for this case. That would, of course, happen later with the Fulton County, Georgia RICO violations case, and that was the mugshot seen around the world. If you've seen T-shirts showing that particular mugshot with Trump and his glorious, semi-angry face there. Everyone knew that that would ultimately result in Trump and other people selling that for merchandise. At this time, April 4th, Judge Juan Merchan was selected to preside over, and of course I brought up the question, was it a random selection? That's supposedly how this works, but it's interesting that you have someone like Juan Merchan, who's also involved in other cases related to Trump associates. That's another one of those question-raising things. Now, of course, Trump, at the time of his arraignment, pleaded not guilty to the charges, and the indictment charges were previously sealed, and then after Trump's plea for not guilty, they unsealed these charges so we could read what these 34 felony counts for business records were. I remember listening to podcasts talking about that and how ridiculous and how concocted these particular charges were, and that some believed that this case wouldn't really see the light of day, that it could end up being dismissed. And if it ended up going to trial, the likelihood of Trump being found guilty was like next to nil, because look at how ridiculous and unusual and concocted this was. And this was something that no one had ever been charged with for the reason that it was. So then that very same day after the arraignment, Trump flew back to Mar-a-Lago and he gave a speech that evening to a crowd. Prosecutors originally wanted the trial to happen in January of 2024, but it eventually was moved later to April. Now, May 31st, 2023, Trump's team filed a motion to dismiss. And then, of course, as we'd expect from someone like Judge Merchan, on August 11th, the court denied the motion to dismiss. September 29th, 2023, Trump's team submitted motions to dismiss further and also requested that the charges be clarified, such as by a bill of particulars, because it seemed like there wasn't quite the understanding of what felony Trump was being charged with. Now, the charges, as I explained in the last episode, there were 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. In New York, you have falsifying business records in the second degree, which is just falsifying business records, and that's a misdemeanor. But Alvin Bragg brought 34 felony charges of falsifying business records, and they're made felonies if they are done to conceal another crime. And it seemed like this another crime wasn't really that obvious from the indictment, from the charges. And so Trump's legal defense in this motion to dismiss, and also motions for requesting that the charges be clarified, were requesting more information about the other crime. Now, the charges did say that he was attempting to, these payments made to his lawyer, Michael Cohen, to reimburse him for legal expenses that Michael Cohen had in 2016 during Trump's campaign were hush money payments to Stormy Daniels to keep her from talking about her affair during the campaign. That, okay, what Trump was doing was reimbursing his lawyer for making payments that were campaign finance violations, like it was declared to be an attempt to interfere with or influence the campaign. Now, that in and of itself is not illegal, and the charges were that Trump was trying to cover up another crime. So they wanted to know what this other crime was. Now, this motion also raised the issue of the statute of limitations, and I read part of this motion, and it talked about how Governor Cuomo's executive orders during the pandemic for temporarily suspending legal proceedings shouldn't be interpreted to allow charges for which the statute of limitations had expired to have an expanded window. So this motion also argued for dismissing the case was because the statute of limitations had clearly expired, and the prosecution argued that it didn't because the clock had been expanded because of these executive orders, which postponed court activity and supposedly then allowed things to stretch beyond where the statute of limitations otherwise would have precluded it. Now, I'll provide a link to this document in the show notes. There are quite a few links, as I said, drinking from a fire hose. Now, of course, Judge Merchan didn't regard these particular arguments. Why? Because it seems he had a political opponent to prosecute and was not willing to forego this particular case. And it seems obvious why, when you consider his donations and his daughter's campaigning. Why would he want to do that?
Ding dong! Jehovah's Witnesses. Ding dong! Mormons. Christian, are you ready to defend the faith when false religions ring your doorbell? Do you know what your Muslim and Jewish friends believe? You will if you get Andrew Rappaport's book, What Do They Believe? When we witness to people, we need to present the truth, but it is very wise to know what they believe, and you will get Andrew Rappaport's book at whatdotheybelieve.com.
February 15th, 2024, so we're getting into this current year and getting closer to when the trial would start. February 15th, Judge Merchan predictably denied the motions to dismiss for the second time here. Now, February 26th, District Attorney Bragg preemptively requested a gag order because his rationale for preemptively requesting a gag order was because in Trump's civil fraud case, now if you remember, this was the one where he allegedly committed a crime for negotiating real estate loans. He treated his properties in New York supposedly as a lower value for tax purposes, but then as a higher value to get loans. But as we know, even the banks to whom Trump got loans said that they loved the business with him. He fully paid the loans. They made money on it and so on. So there was no crime because there were no victims in that particular trial. And during that trial, Judge Engoron, I'm not sure quite how you pronounce it there, Judge Engoron had fined Trump twice for violating his gag orders. So D.A. Alvin Bragg requested from Judge Merchan to issue a gag order, even before the trial started, because Trump has a history of being gagged and violating gag orders. Now, March 26th, Judge Merchan did put a gag order on Trump before the trial to keep him from harassing members of the court or witnesses on social media. Now, Trump would frequently say things on social media that he believed, this is a rigged trial, he's having his constitutional rights taken away, that this trial shouldn't even be happening, and he'd make statements about how Judge Merchan could not be an impartial judge, and his daughter's fundraising, and of course, you might argue that he has the First Amendment right to say things in his own defense like this, because if he feels that this is an unjust trial, given the partiality of people involved, D.A. Bragg's and Judge Mershon's histories here and associations and family members, that, he wants the public to know, because he's campaigning for president, just how much of what he believes this is that this is a sham trial. Now, on April 1st, Judge Mershon expanded the gag order to include family members of Mershon and Bragg, particularly because Trump had mentioned Mershon's daughter, and, there's the claim that Trump has a lot of loyal followers, and whoever he criticizes, that might incite loyal followers to want to be hitmen or something. April 2nd, the next day, Trump's team requested again that Mershon recuse himself. And then April 15th, the first day of the trial, Judge Mershon wanted to put to rest any idea that he would recuse himself. Now, briefly, I want to get into the jury selection. On April 8th, 2024, jury selection began, and 96 potential jurors from which to choose the 12 who would be primary jurors and up to 6 alternatives. Yeah. Right from the start of this, how could anyone even think that you could have a trial of a former president who's a controversial figure in Manhattan, New York, and even begin to have the ability to have a jury that would consist of all people who are impartial? And of course, that's the argument for why you shouldn't even have this type of stuff happening. You shouldn't have unless you're certain that Trump is a threat, like an actual violent threat, and that these charges were really warranted, like there was an actual crime committed, that justice must be done. Why even bring a trial like this and even pretend to have a pool of impartial jurors? Everyone knows who Donald Trump is, and everyone has an opinion about Donald Trump. So as expected, about over half of the jurors from this pool of 96 were dismissed quickly on the first day of jury selection because they admitted that they couldn't be impartial after answering some questions. So how could anyone be impartial about Donald Trump? And there ended up being 2 lawyers on the jury, so if anyone who was hoping for a verdict of an acquittal, they might think that 2 members of the jury who had some knowledge of the law might think that the charges could be ridiculous, that there's no basis for this kind of scheme. Their hope was based on the possibility that there were 2 lawyers on the jury. And at best, there was 1 jury member that might have had conservative views because Fox News was among his listed sources of news. Now, he listed several mainstream news sources and, of course, Google, internet and stuff, but, he actually gets some news from Fox News. He listed Fox News, so maybe this one person might have conservative views. And 1 woman juror possibly had religious views because, as she mentioned news sources, she mentioned listening to podcasts, and some of them would be about faith. But, of course, that could still mean a lot of different things. Now, other than those 2, the rest of the jurors seemed to be mainstream Manhattanites who probably just could not wait. They were chomping on the bit to reach a jury verdict. Now, of course, I'm giving my own assessment and personal opinion about what went on here. I'll provide a link to an article from The Guardian that talks about the 12 primary jurors who ultimately were selected and how they answered those questions. And those who wondered if Trump would get a fair trial from those descriptions were probably very disappointed. So now we covered some pretrial stuff, the activities, the filings, the motions, the characters involved, Judge Mershon and his daughter, District Attorney Alvin Bragg, Matthew Colangelo. We did jury selection, and so now on to the trial in the next episode. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, rapid fire details, and hopefully it wasn't too boring with dates and events and stuff like that, because I'm sure that covering the actual trial, when we get into the testimonies of Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels, that there could be a little more entertainment there. But I just felt it was necessary to cover some events leading up to the trial to show that I did my homework here. And so, stay tuned for the next episode of Truth Espresso, and God bless.
Thank you for waking up with Truth Espresso. Good morning, and God bless your day.
Hey friends, Daniel Minnick here again. If you liked waking up to this episode of Truth Espresso, I would really appreciate it if you would rate it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever application you use to listen to Truth Espresso.